Good morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross from PTCGRadio, and we have reached the top 8 of the Doncaster Winner Box. Now, what I must say at the beginning is this is the 6th video from this particular tournament that I have uploaded, and I very heartily suggest you go back and watch the first 5. I have put links to all of those in the description of this video, so have a look at the description. There are links to all 5 of the videos, and you can go from there. The reason is we've seen both these players before, and I'm going to be talking about their decks, referring back to things that happened in other videos. It's going to make more sense if you do that. Plus, of course, these are good videos. The point of this series of videos is Roaring Skies has just been released. It's not yet legal for tournament play, but this was a tournament, an unsanctioned tournament in the UK, with a lot of good players who already have their Worlds invites, who came along and took part and, showed us the new cards and the new decks from Roaring Skies. So it's an opportunity for a lot of people to get a look at these decks, whereas they may not have had a chance, otherwise. And we've all done our testing in our little groups, but we all know that that's not always that useful, because we think, oh, I beat Seismitoad every turn, then Seismitoad comes out with a different list and we're a little bit screwed. I don't know why it's doing this once a video, but bear with me, it'll go. There we go. So on the left we have Scott Burgess, the current UK national champion, who is going to be playing Trevenant Shaymin, and we've seen in a couple of videos. On the right we have Sid, who we haven't seen since round 2, taking on Max's Latios deck. But he is back. They've both made it through to the top 8. Scott made it through as the first seed, undefeated with a 5-0 record. One of the things which I love about Scott is that he doesn't ID. IDing, and one of my things is IDing screws somebody over. If you ID with your round 5 opponent, well then your round 5 opponent gets into cut, but then you're screwing over somebody else who would have got into cut had you not ID'd. So you're always screwing over someone as well as helping them. Scott is a man who doesn't ID, and that makes me happy. Partly because it means that everybody else just relies on their own result, not getting ID'd out of cut, because many, many people have been ID'd out of cuts since IDs came in. And also, it means we get people going XO in tournaments, which doesn't happen very much anymore. People get, they win as many games as they need to, and then they just ID intentional draw all the way into cut. So Scott made it into cut as the top seed with a 5-0 record, and Sid scraped in as the 8th seed. So we shall see if Sid can cause a bit of an upset here. So Sid is... Nope, Scott's going first, and he started Shaymin, which is bad, but he's got a Phantump on the bench. He's going to need a switch or a float stone, because the last thing he wants is for Sid to be able to have that Seismitoad active, using Quaking Punch, playing Laser. That Shaymin will not live for very long. The other thing is, and we did see this in the previous game in round 5 between Scott and Ryan, as we see a Juniper go in there from Scott. We saw in the previous game that Seismitoad with a Muscle Banded Quaking Punch does 50, add 30 for a Laser with Verbank adds up to 80, and it will actually, the Shaymin dies going into your turn again, so you get kind of a free 2 prizes. Now, unfortunately, we saw Scott play the Juniper there, and what that means is there's going to be no Wally for a turn 1 Trevenant with Trainer Lock. The other thing, of course, is that even if he put the Phantump up, Phantump's only got 60 HP, a Laser Muscle Band or Laser Verbank means that there would have been the KO on the Phantump. The advantage Scott has is he's got a Muscle Band down on each of the Phantump there, and he's got his energy attachment onto one of them. So he's in a position to do some good things. And let's not forget that Scott's deck can make comeback. We've seen that already this tournament. So it's not necessarily the end of the world to go down 2 prizes. He'd rather not. But if it happens, he can make that comeback. He's trading prizes very, very well. However, Sid, as we saw back in round 2, is not playing your standard Seismitoad list. He's playing Mewtwo. He's playing basic Water Energy. He's playing Quillfish. He's playing Dusknoir. And we see a Pokemon Center Lady coming out. That's an interesting card to go for. I think that's what he just got with a Jirachi, if I'm not mistaken. So he must be expecting a Laser next turn or something along those lines, and he must not have the DCE. Because if he had the DCE, then... No, he was just getting rid of it with Ultra Ball. I was going to say, that wouldn't make a huge amount of sense. unless he didn't have the DCE and was terrified of laser next turn, which I suppose is possible. It's also nice to see someone using that Mega Metagross mat. You don't see that used very often. It's not my favourite mat, you just don't see it used. I like to see it get a bit of love. So the Dusknoir goes down there, and we do see the laser. Now, it's a lot to ask for at this stage in the turn, but having said that, you got the Mewtwo, the Shaymin, and I think he's got a Juniper in hand if he hasn't replayed his supporter. So, we see Magnetic Storm going down. That is the stadium which gets rid of resistance from, I don't know if, Trevenant has resistance to fighting, but I'm pretty sure Sid's not playing any fighting Pokemon. Shaymin, incidentally, also has a resistance to fighting, so not the most exciting stadium, but it gets it out of his hand, and if you don't need it, it's best to play it. Note, that is a proxy, so it will be a Burbank City gym. There we go. As I said in one of the previous videos, we do allow proxies in this tournament because it's 10 days after the set came out. Not everybody's been able to get the cards they need. Although Burbank City Gym has been out a little while now. Just putting it out there. So we got the Burbank, we saw the Quaking Punch for 30, and the laser puts him up to 60. The one thing this will do, as there was no muscle band going down, it means that Shaymin will be on 90 at the end of Scott's turn, and the Shaymin will die going into Scott's turn, meaning Scott will then be able to have the first attack, with the new Pokemon, rather than it dying going into Sid's turn, and Sid being able to get a free hit on whatever Scott chooses to put active. So, thank heavens for small mercies, I suppose. That Startling Megaphone's going to suck because it gets rid of both of the muscle bands. And we see a rare candy into Dusknoir. That is brutal, and that shows how Scott has been done in, essentially, by not being able to have the Trevenant active by starting with a Shaymin. Had Sid been trainer locked, we wouldn't have just seen that rare candy, and we wouldn't have seen the Startling Megaphone, and Scott would be in a much better position. And this is the thing with a lot of these decks, and we're going to see this more and more, especially and that was a cool little play from Sid there, Skylaring for a bicycle, emptying his hand, and drawing 4. And you see there, he's got the Dusknoir out. Dusknoir has the Sinister Hand ability, which allows you to basically move damage around your opponent's side of the field. And this is going to be very, very bad for Scott. He's got to get the Shaymin out of the active, because the problem is that Shaymin will now never leave the active unless Scott gets it out. What Sid's going to try and do, and we see Lysandra there bringing up the Dusknoir, because the Dusknoir has a retreat cost of 3, and he's only got a Mystery Energy, so Mystery Energy can only be attached to a Psychic Pokemon, so he can't use it to retreat the Shaymin, because if he attaches it, it'll be discarded right away. So what Sid's going to try and do is keep that Shaymin in the active. It's going to take 30 damage from poison every turn, plus whatever else Sid can use, and he's just going to continually move the damage off the Shaymin. That means the Shaymin never dies. Scott at this stage will be happy if the Shaymin died, because if the Shaymin dies, Scott can stick his Trevenant into the active, Sid will then be trainer locked, and Scott can start doing his Fang. But with the Shaymin in the active, Scott's got to get it out the active. If he's trainer locked, that means no switch, that means no float stone. It means he's got to manually retreat it. Now, it's only got a retreat cost of 1, but that is still potentially awkward. And you saw in the previous turn, Scott put the energy on the Trevenant on the second Trevenant rather than the first, and the reason was for exactly what you've just seen. If he puts all the energy on one Trevenant, Sid can just move the damage around and kill that one Trevenant. Now here's kind of an interesting little thing. He's had to play an escape rope to get the Seismitoad into the active, and as the only thing on Scott's bench was a Trevenant, it means Sid's trainer locked himself. Unfortunately for Scott, that's not going to have a huge problem, because Sid can then just put 60 damage on the Trevenant. A muscle-banded Quaking Punch will do 50 damage, putting the Trevenant up to 110 in total, and will in fact kill the Trevenant. Scott is now 2 prizes behind. All he's got is a Shaymin, and he scoops there and then. Far from ideal, of course, but that's kind of what happens. What else can you do? And we've just seen the best of Sid's deck. Now, don't get me wrong, Sid went in as the 8th seed. Now, he had a few draws, which is what really did it. But one of the major problems with these teched out Seismitoad lists is you lose a consistency. Now, when we've seen Ryan Morehouse's deck in this tournament so far, we've mostly seen him playing against trainer or ability lock decks, so he hasn't been able to go to his full power. But in the previous game, I think it was, or previous match, I believe it was in game 2, where Ryan had that first turn where he must have drawn through like 40 cards, getting everything he needed. That is how fast and consistent Seismitoad Shaymin can be. Sid's deck is not that fast and it's not that consistent. He's playing more energy, which is good because you've got more energy, and bad because energy clogs up your hand because you can only attach one per turn. It's not like a Pokemon you can bench or a trainer card that you can play. He's also playing a Dusknoir line. Now he's playing at least a 2-1-1, possibly more, and he's playing Rare Candy, all of which takes away from his consistency, and he's playing Mewtwo. So, on the one hand, less consistent. On the other hand, he can stop using Quaking Punch to use Grenade Hammer, that being Seismitoad's attack that does 130 damage and 30 to 2 of your benched Pokemon. That means if you're in a Seismitoad on Seismitoad matchup and you're both sitting there doing 30 damage per turn, you can sit there and get a big KO. Now that can be a problem because then you're not trainer locked, your opponent isn't, then they can go for the whole muscle band and head ringer and enhanced hammer shenanigans. But, you know, it's options. You don't have to use it. It gives you options your opponent doesn't have. You can build up Mewtwo for the big KO. And, of course, you saw in that game, Dusknoir's amazing. The best use for Dusknoir, as we just saw, is if you can strand something in the active while they're trainer locked, you can just move all the damage to the bench, especially if they're poisoned as well and taking more and more damage. You can strand them in the active, move all the damage to the bench, and you force them to manually retreat the active because they ain't using a switch or an escape rope if they're stranded in the active and trainer locked. Now, annoyingly for Scott here, he has just started Shaymin both games. He's playing 4 Phantump, 3 Shaymin, and 1 Jirachi, so he's got a 50% chance of starting a Phantump. Annoyingly for me, when I played Scott in round 1, in both games, he started Phantump. Just saying. Now here's an interesting thing. Oh, if he's got a Wally in hand, this is going to be an awesome fun play. What he's basically doing here, he's going to Ultra Ball for a Phantump. He's put the energy and the muscle band on Shaymin, and this is essentially, he's going to just go for the Shaymin to draw extra cards. Apparently he doesn't have the Phantump yet. And what this is going to allow him to do is essentially attack Seismitoad for 50 damage. The attack of Shaymin does 30 plus 20 for the muscle band, and then the Shaymin and all cards attached to it will go into his hand. What that means is he essentially gets a Shaymin out of the active and hopefully puts a Trevenant in the active. Now, he's not going to be able to do that this turn, and you'll notice there Scott's just had to Ultra Ball away 2 Trevenant, which is not ideal, and a DCE and a Psychic Energy. This is going to lower his chances of being able to get a Trevenant, or at least to stream Trevenants with the correct energy. Now the good news is the DCE attached to Shaymin is going to go back into Scott's hand, assuming Sid doesn't play any Enhanced Hammer and play them. Now Scott's not going to be able to do that attack this turn, but we've seen that he's, it's not looking like he's going to get a Trevenant this turn. Oh no, he is going to get a Trevenant this turn. Now what he could do here, and this is a big risk-reward play. He's already put the muscle band on the Shaymin, so he can't put a float stone down. If he's got a switch, he needs to play the switch. If not, this is a big risk-reward play. We've already seen 2 Trevenant hit the discard pile. We've now got 1 in the active. Until he plays Lyssandra's trump card, he has got a maximum of 1 Trevenant left in the deck, and that's assuming it's not prized. We've also seen 1 DCE hit the discard pile, and there's 1 attached to that Shaymin. If he manually retreats the Shaymin using the DCE in order to put the Trevenant active and trainer lock Sid from turn 1 of the game, he would then have 2 DCE in the discard pile, and again, he'd have a maximum of 2 left for the game. Until he played a Lyssandra's trump card, which is worrying. You see him play a VS Seeker there to get the Wally just because VS Seeker is going to clog his hand if he's trainer locked next turn. And this is... It's a dodgy play. This is going to work out fine for Scott on the proviso that DCE stays attached to him and that he doesn't get lasered and stay asleep. Here comes the laser. It is that a heads or a tails? It's a tails. I think it came off as a 5. Because if Shaymin is put to sleep with laser and stays asleep, there's going to be no attacking next turn. And as we've seen, Shaymin dies pretty quickly. The one saving grace we've got is a floatstone on the Seismitoad, but there's nothing to stop Sid benching a second Seismitoad with a muscle band and a DCE. The good news is, at least for Scott, and there's another laser from Sid. The good news, at least for Scott, is that Seismitoad is asleep, and it looks like, yeah, there is a head, so Scott needs to wake up next turn. Most of these Seismitoad decks, because they play Floatstone, Super Scoop Up, etc., don't play many switches. And because Sid's going for the tricks, he's not going to play the full 4 Super Scoop Up and a Scoop Up Cyclone that we saw decks like Ryan's playing. But if we look in his hand, we can see there's an escape rope there. So potentially he's going to be able to get out of the active. However, when there's a DCE, he just doesn't. Oh, that is gutting. If Sid had a Seismitoad, he'd be able to play the escape rope, attach the DCE, and trainer lock. Now, is the Shaymin going to wake up? What is it with good players and not being able to keep the dice on the table? There we go. Shaymin wakes up, and this is now good. Scott is now potentially back in the driving seat. He can get an attack this turn. He can get the Trevenant active. He can leave Sid trainer locked, and this is going to be pretty nice. Because the Seismitoad is active and it's poisoned. Now he is going to be able to retreat the Seismitoad because of that floatstone that we have attached. But if he retreats, then he's going to need a DCE in order to attack. And now we start seeing, the downside of Sid's deck a little bit. Sid didn't do very much that turn at all. He got a floatstone on the Seismitoad, he got 1 energy attached, and he played a laser. It's not very much, not compared to a lot of these decks we've seen. So here comes the Juniper, and what Scott really wants is, there it is, he wants a Psychic Energy. What he wants to do is attach a Psychic Energy to the Trevenant. He can then attach with the Shaymin to do 50 damage, and of course that Seismitoad is still taking poison damage. So Shaymin then goes back to Scott's hand. Oh, and there's another laser, try and put him asleep again. Didn't work, but Scott's thinking, well, he's going to be trainer locked next turn, so he might as well play all of his trainers. He wouldn't have played that laser if he could have used it next turn. Sid needs 1 energy to trainer lock him next turn. So he's going to be able to attack with a Shaymin, do 50 damage, which will leave Seismitoad on 8 in total if he doesn't hit a Burbank City gym. And that means the Shaymin and the DCE and the Muscle Band are going to go back to his hand. He's going to have the Shaymin to use next turn to try and draw more cards. And he's also going to have the DCE in his hand, which he can attach to the Trevenant and then start attacking. And actually, and you saw there again, he used the VS Seeker because he's expecting to be trainer locked. It's going to be more useful. So Seismitoad's going to go up to 80 here, which means he's going to be on 90 going into Scott's turn. Scott is then going to do 80 damage, and the Seismitoad will actually die from poison. So if that Seismitoad doesn't come out the active, it's going to die. Ah, and there we see... Oh, that's not a Pokemon Center lady. I'm being an idiot. That is a Pokemon fan club. I think I called it a Pokemon Center lady last game. That was very silly of me. I apologise for that. If you've already popped in the comments about that, you have my apologies. It's these full art supporters. I'm not into them. Don't get me wrong, they're beautiful. I just use the cheap supporters. So, yeah, not so used to the full arts. Anyway, so he's used a Pokemon fan club to get a Quillfish and a Duskull. And here, I mean, yeah, he's got to do this. Like I said, the maths was going to work, so that Seismitoad was going down next turn. But I don't... Yeah, no, see, what I'm thinking here is that he's used the Shaymin to attack, do 50 damage to the Trevenant, which incidentally will be a free hit KO, and with or without the Muscle Band, it doesn't really matter. Even though he's not going to be able to reattach the Muscle Band, it'll still take 2 more hits to KO. And I was thinking we'll put the Quillfish active, because if you put the Quillfish active, then you're doing, 20 damage is going on the Trevenant to attack the Quillfish. The problem is, you've then got to try and get the Quillfish out of the active under Trainer Lock. You don't have enough energy attached to your Seismitoad to do the damage as it is. So you'd have the Quillfish stuck in the active, which isn't the worst thing if you're taking a bit of damage and you're giving a bit of damage. But of course, Trevenant's attack does 20 damage to each of 2 bench Pokemon. So essentially, the Quillfish would be dying, and 20 damage would go on the Seismitoad, and 20 damage on the Dusknoir, just to put 20 damage on the Trevenant. And clearly, ladies and gentlemen, that ain't worth it. So, Sid was put in an impossible position there, because, if he puts up the Dusknoir's going to die. Now, Seismitoad's got 80 damage on him, which means he's got 100 HP left. Trevenant's doing 80. If Scott can hit a Verbank laser here, he's got the KO. It's somewhat frustrating for Scott. It might be that he played 2 lasers last turn, which means he didn't have one to use this turn. But there was a Seismitoad there with 1 energy. Scott was within his rights to assume that he was going to end up Trainer Locked this turn. So he did make the best play under the circumstances. It's just a shame he's not going to get the KO here. Now, if Scott hits Lysandra next turn, and I honestly can't remember if we've seen Scott play one or not, what would be kind of cool is that Seismitoad's now got 20 HP left. So if Scott could hit Lysandra next turn, he could pull up something like the Dusknoir or the Quillfish, and he'd actually be able to kill the Seismitoad on the bench through the residual 20 damage, which would be pretty cool. So we see a manual evolution up to Dusklops there, because Sid's going to need that Dusknoir, although there's not really that much damage on the field at the moment, so we do have to just remember that, he's not doing... Dusknoir is really, really good when you're there and you've got the opportunity to start going and doing a huge amount of damage and then moving it around. When there's very little damage on your opponent's side of the field, it doesn't really do a huge amount. Now, if you're wondering what Quillfish's attack does, it's for a DCE, it does 20 damage and poisons your opponent. This is a bit of a desperation move from Sid here, although I think Sid's made a little bit of a misplay here. Oh, and that's beautiful. Okay, it's become irrelevant because Scott did have the Lysandra as I suggested he should. And you can see there he's starting to build up the second Trevenant, and this game is not going to last much longer. We've seen from Scott's deck before, this is not going to take long for Scott to finish this off. And the reason why he shouldn't have put the Quillfish active is the Seismitoad is going to die regardless. So he might as well have popped an energy on the Seismitoad, done some damage and Trainer Locked Scott, rather than manually putting the Seismitoad on the bench, because if you put the Seismitoad on the bench, if Scott hadn't had a Lysandra, you would have just given him 2 prizes by putting the Seismitoad on the bench. And it doesn't look like he's scooped yet, but it shouldn't take very long. Scott's just taken 3 prizes, and honestly, I would be surprised if Scott was Trainer Locked this turn. Sid would need a Seismitoad, and Sid would need a double colourless energy. Now, what he can do here, if he could get a Float Stone, and again, he's Trainer Locked here, so he'd have to get out of the Trainer Lock. If he could get a Float Stone here, what he could potentially do is just attack with the Seismitoad, leaves the Quillfish active. Attack with the Seismitoad, leaves the Quillfish active. Now, Scott's got a clever play going here. He doesn't want to be taking damage by attacking the Quillfish. So what? Oh, and there's a Xerosic to get rid of the DC on the Quillfish, just to add insult to injury. And if Scott's got a laser here, he's actually going to get the KO. But it doesn't look like he does, otherwise he wouldn't have played the Xerosic. What he's going to do here is he's going to attack with the Shaymin. It's going to do 50 damage, putting Quillfish on 70 damage, leaving him with 10 HP. Shaymin takes 2 damage counters from attacking the Quillfish, and then goes straight back to Scott's hand, essentially healing off the damage straight away, while the Trevenant goes back into the active and leaves Sid Trainer Locked. So It's not looking good, I'm going to be honest with you. Oh, and Sid's already passed again. There goes the Verbank City Gym. Little bit later, but, you know, better late than never. Well, that's what they say, but actually, I don't know if it's going to make any difference at all here. We see a computer search coming down, and apparently Scott waited a while, and Verbank City Gyms are like buses. You don't get any, and 3 come along at once. Bit annoying when you can't find a card, then you just draw it over and over again when it's too late. He only needs 1 of them. So, hey-ho. So what's Scott going to go for here? I would imagine it's going to be either a Psychic Energy or it's going to be a Laser. If he plays a Laser, the Quillfish is going to die from poison damage. Or a Lysandra if he's got one left in his deck. And he doesn't need one. He could get a VS Seeker and go for the Lysandra. So he is going to go for the Psychic Energy so that he can attack. I'd like to see a Lysandra here because he can drag out the Seismitoad. He shouldn't drag out the Shaymin, so Shaymin can just do his attack and go back to the bench. Oh, there's an Enhanced Hammer just to add insult to injury. He's got 3 prizes left, so by attacking he could pull up the Seismitoad, do a bit of damage to that, and then kill the Quillfish from residual bench damage. Because you only take the damage counters when you attack Quillfish when he's the active. So that's what Scott really wants here. But clearly doesn't have it, unfortunately. So he's not going to get the win next turn, but it's not going to take very long. And here, if he does the residual, he's going to do the 20 damage to the Seismitoad and to the Shaymin, and that means that the Seismitoad will then become a 2-hit KO. More importantly, the Shaymin will then become a 1-hit KO, and it looks like Scott's got a Lysandra in hand, so all he's going to have to do next turn is pull up the Shaymin, do the attack for 80 damage, and then, unless Sid plays an N, and we've seen that Sid does play N, but unless Sid plays an N this turn, Scott has got game 2. It's as simple as that. Because there's no other way Sid can win. Even if Scott doesn't have a Lysandra, or, I mean, we know he does, but even if Sid plays an N, it's surely only a matter of time here. Scott's deck, as we've seen, and Sid scoops, and we're going to game 3, because he knows there's nothing to do here. As we've seen with Scott's deck in previous videos, if it gets set up, and he's doing 80 damage plus 20 to 2 bench Pokemon, plus poison damage every turn, he wins. We haven't seen him lose a game when he's been set up. We haven't seen him, we only seen him lose the odd game. We've seen Scott lose because he hasn't been able to get set up. We saw in this very match, in game 1, Sid just got a good start game 1, and he got the Dusknoir out, and he managed to pull the Shaymin into the active, and Scott couldn't get the Shaymin out of the active, and it was as simple as that. It does bring up a little flaw, though. You'll notice Scott's playing Mystery Energy. Mystery Energy is a Psychic Energy, but can only be attached to Psychic Pokemon, and it reduces the retreat cost by 2. Now, interestingly enough, the retreat cost of Trevenant is free, so you'd actually have to discard the Mystery Energy. The Mystery Energy wouldn't give Trevenant free retreat, it would bring it down to 1. But it means if you've got a DC and a Mystery Energy on the Trevenant, you only have to discard the Mystery Energy rather than having to discard all 3 if you want to retreat it. Now, usually, Mystery Energy is bad, because Mystery Energy, it doesn't do enough, whereas Strong Energy, 20 extra damage, is worth the risk. As we've discussed on a number of these videos, Special Energy is unsafe. You've got Xerasic, you've got Enhanced Hammer, it doesn't always stay on very long, especially with the format at the moment. There are a lot of cards that get rid of it, which see a lot of play. So Mystery Energy isn't usually worth the risk. Of course, when you're playing Trevenant, Enhanced Hammer and Crushing Hammer are no longer a thing, although Crushing Hammer, I suppose, would get rid of basic Psychic just the same, and you're still vulnerable to Xerasic, but that's much less of an issue than, just Enhanced Hammer, because less people are playing it, and you've got to use your supporter for the turn. Now, it did actually come back to bite Scott last turn, though, and he finally starts with a Phantump, but Sid starts with a Seismitoad, and that's a very good starter. Oh, and he's got a Laser there as well. And interestingly enough, that there was one turn where he really could have used the Mystery Energy to be a basic Psychic to retreat the Shaymin. So with Jirachi and Shaymin both having a retreat cost of 1, the Mystery Energy can occasionally be a pain. Now, you've heard in these videos so far that I'm not a fan of attaching a DCE turn 1 when I know my opponent is playing things like Enhanced Hammer, but I suppose it's not the end of the world here because he had to play the Juniper, and I've been overly cautious in the past. I've had many games where I've said I'm not attaching the DCE because I want to get a basic water because that's going to be better. You play the Juniper and draw nothing. So because he was going to play the Juniper anyway, attaching the DCE I think was the right thing to do. Speaking of the right thing to do, he played a red card on his first turn of the game, which is harsh. Scott is now starting on his first turn with 4 cards in hand and an active Phantom which is poisoned. That is it. That is everything that Scott has. And has he just drawn 5 cards? I believe he's just drawn 5 cards there. Although, oh no, my apologies, because Sid clearly just passed. Now, depressingly, Scott's having to get rid of the Xerasic with an Ultra Ball, and he doesn't want to do that. He wants to use a Xerasic to get the DC off of the Seismitoad. But maybe he'll draw into Enhanced Hammer. We've seen that he plays that. Now, this is what's so good about Shaymin in the format at the moment. Because under other circumstances, this would be horrific. Being put down to 4 cards, you're just hoping to draw a Juniper. Here, however, Scott can play an Ultra Ball for the Shaymin. He's now got 3 cards in hand, because he had 5 cards and he's played the Ultra Ball, which essentially goes down to 3, and then the Shaymin. So he'll be drawing at least 3 from the Shaymin. But there may be other cards in his hand that he can play. So hopefully he's going to get quite lucky there. And the fact that he hasn't attached an energy, no, that's irrelevant, because he wouldn't have attached the energy anyway, because I hate to be mean, that Phantom gone die. So he's got the laser there, which is both fun because he's poisoning the Seismitoad, and it means that he's got 1 less card in his hand. So he plays a Shaymin, he's drawing up to 5, and he's going to need a Phantom. Now, we see a second laser there. Still comes up tails on the sleep flip. Honestly, as I keep saying in this game, he might as well play the laser because, I mean, there's an active Seismitoad with a DCE. So there's no pretty sure he is going to be Trainer Lock next turn. I suppose he could maybe play an Escape Rope. And you see him thinking there about the DCE. There's a few considerations here. On the one hand, it's, is my Phantom going to live long enough? And on the other hand, there's the, is he just going to play an Enhanced Hammer or a Xerasic or a Team Flagrant or something along those lines? Now, if I remember correctly, Scott hasn't actually played a supporter this turn. So what Scott's doing is hedging his bets, essentially. And you'll see he's going for the Ultra Ball there. He might just get a Jirachi and go straight for the Wally. Or he might, I think he's playing 4 Wally in this deck. He's playing quite a few of them. So he might go for the Shaymin just to increase the amount of cards he's got, give himself some more options and hope to draw the Shaymin. But no, he has gone straight for the Jirachi. And that's what I was going to suggest because it's too risky at this stage. Because you've put a DCE on the Phantom now. By putting the DCE on the Phantom, you've got to evolve it into a Trevenant. If you don't evolve it into a Trevenant, then you run the risk of, well, it going very, very badly. If you don't evolve it into the Trevenant, then not only are you going to lose your only Phantom, you're going to lose a DCE, and your opponent's not trainer locked. Here, the Shaymin would have given him a better card advantage. Oh, and there goes the VS Seeker for Xerasic as he's not trainer locked. But here, he's in a decent position. Because he's no longer poisoned because he evolved. He's now trainer locked Sid, which takes away some of Sid's options. He's got the DCE attached to the Trevenant, which means he just needs a Psychic Energy to be able to attack next turn. So it's all coming together a little bit here. He's in a precarious position. There's no second Phantom on the bench. All he's got is that Trevenant. And there goes the fan club again. And presumably he's probably going to go for, well, one would imagine at least a Dusknoir. Maybe he's going to go for a Mewtwo here. Now, we haven't seen him need it this turn, but one of the cool things about Mewtwo is that Mewtwo can one-hit KO Trevenant, and as we've seen, Trevenant's a stage 1 that requires 2 energy attachments to attack. So if you can start one-hit KOing Trevenants, that is another way to beat his deck. But it looks like he's gone for a Shaymin and a Duskull. Clearly, he needs more cards in his hand, and Shaymin is the way to go. It does mean his bench is going to be full, and he's not going to be able to get the Mewtwo, but he doesn't need the Mewtwo now. It's something to bear in mind for later on. And he's actually got the Dusknoir in his hand there, so he's going to be digging for, well, the Dusclops, unfortunately, because there's going to be no rare candy, not while the Trevenant's active. Now, the good news is that Seismitoad continues to take poison damage. There's another Phantump. And Sid popped a basic water down on this Seismitoad there, which is brilliant because he knows that Scott's got a Xerosic in hand. He knows that that DCE is going to go if Scott wants it to go. So by attaching the water energy, he doesn't need to get a DCE next turn. He just needs to get a basic water. Should also bear in mind, of course, that if he now attaches another water energy, he can Grenade Hammer, which one-hit KOs a Trevenant, and although it gives up the Trainer Lock, he's still one-hit KOing Trevenant, and when you're one-hit KOing Trevenants, your opponent can run out of Trevenants, and as I mentioned, back at the beginning of this video and in previous videos where we've seen Scott's deck, if you're doing 50 damage a turn with Shaymin, it's not good enough, you're going to lose. Now, interestingly here, Scott's going for a different tact, and that tact is, rather than start attacking you now, I'm going to attach a DCE to the Phantom. We've seen this with Scott's play before, and it is absolutely the correct way to go. It's a cautious play, but there is a situation here where Scott attaches Psychic Energy, he does 60 damage and 20 to 2 of the bench, and then Sid just goes Water Energy Grenade Hammer, and Scott's got maybe a Trevenant with no energy. And if he takes a turn to attach an energy, then Sid's just going to go Grenade Hammer. Now, that could happen next turn. Sid still could have done that, and then Scott would have one turn of attacking, and then Sid could Grenade Hammer again. But it almost kind of convinces Sid not to. Whereas if you've just got all your eggs in one Trevenant-shaped basket, then the Grenade Hammer becomes a very attractive play. Now, the problem here is Scott is starting to build up quite a lot of damage on his side of the field. And you will notice that Sid has a Dusclops out. And you will also notice, I think if I remember correctly, he's got a Dusknoir in hand. Now, that means that Sid essentially needs a Lysandra, and the game gets very, very difficult for Scott. Because he can't switch, and he can't play an Escape Rope, and he can't play a Muscle Band. All he can do is manually retreat. And it's going to take an energy to manually retreat. And Scott's not playing a huge amount of energy. He doesn't need to for his deck. Oh, he does need one energy, though. Has he got it? Has he got a mystery energy there? Yes, he has. And, of course, as previously mentioned in the gap between games 2 and 3, if all Scott draws is a mystery energy, he's not going to be able to retreat the Shaymin or the Jirachi. So what Sid's going to try and do here, if he's got a Dusknoir and a Lysandra, and he might even have both of them in hand, I can't remember what's in his hand. It's not, we get little glimpses from this angle, but we don't get to see it in a huge amount of detail. But if he's got a Dusknoir Lysandra, this game's about to go, and there is the Dusknoir as I thought he had, and I'm sure I saw Lysandra in his hand. I think he's just put it to the front there, yeah. I don't know why he'd go Jirachi. That seems silly. Both Jirachi and Shaymin have the same retreat cost of 1, so they're just as easy or difficult to get out of the active, but the difference is that Jirachi's got 90 HP, so he's more likely to be accidentally killed than Shaymin, who's got 110. In reality, it doesn't really make a difference because he's doing, 50 damage plus laser. He's doing a maximum of 80 damage, which doesn't kill Jirachi or Shaymin. But the point is, it's still, you know, it's these tiny little inconsequential plays that probably don't matter in the long run, but it's just kind of getting into good habits. If you want something in the active, to hold in the active, you want well, first of all, the highest retreat if they're trainer locked, and then the second deciding factor is the highest HP. He doesn't want Trevenant in the active because that would leave him trainer locked, and he doesn't. No, I'm being silly. I am absolutely incorrect here. My logic was absolutely fine, except for, and I'm sure some of you have already realised the mistake I've made. I don't mind making mistakes in these videos, by the way. This is how we learn. Have you realised it yet? The Shaymin can just use the attack for 30 damage and go back to Scott's hand, and then the Trevenant goes active. The Jirachi can't attack, and it's going to be difficult to retreat. So I apologise to Sid there. Getting the Jirachi was absolutely the right play. Although, what I was saying about, in general, you go for the highest retreat followed by the highest HP is correct, but you need to bear in mind, don't pull something active that's going to be able to attack its way out, like a Donphan. You don't want to pull a Donphan active because it can just spinning turn back to the bench. So Sid here, he did the play I suggested, with the correct Pokemon, which apparently I was going to get wrong. And you notice he also went straight for a VS Seeker for a Lysandra, which of course was key because had Scott been able to retreat the Jirachi for a Trevenant, Sid could have just done the whole thing over again. And here comes a Dimension Valley from Scott. He mentioned it a little while ago here, but it's another stadium card. It's the one which reduces the attack cost of Psychic Pokemon by 1. It means Trevenant can attack for 2 Psychic rather than a Psychic double colourless. Truth be told, doesn't make a huge difference in the long run, but he really doesn't want to be poisoned with Burbank City Gym out active, and it does increase his chances of attacking with Trevenant. The biggest problem here is getting that Jirachi out of the active, bearing in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that Mystery Energy won't do it. I like Mystery Energy as a play, but the one big downside is you can't use it to retreat Pokemon that are dragged active. And honestly, I don't want to be premature here, but I think Sid's got this. Because Sid is going to keep up the trainer lock here. The only way for Scott to get out of the trainer lock is to Lysandra something up and hope Sid can't get it in the active. Remember that Trevenant locks from the active, so Sid can Lysandra around it, but Seismitoad locks from the attack. So even if Scott would to Lysandra something on the bench, Sid would get a turn to get it out of the active. Now, the Dusknoir would be the obvious choice, but that's got a float stone attached. He could grab up the Quillfish, but Sid will be able to manually retreat or play an escape rope or a switch or something like that, which would, you know, he's going to have a decent chance to get it out of the active. And now I believe Sid just played an N a second ago, if I remember correctly. So what Scott's basically done is waited until he doesn't think Sid has a Lysandra, or indeed he doesn't know for a fact that Sid has a Lysandra, and then he's gone and put the Trevenant in the active. There's no point retreating a Jirachi when you know your opponent's got Lysandra in hand. It's a complete and utter waste of time. Here, Scott's left it a turn or two, and, you know, very much the way to go, very much the correct play. So Scott's going to try getting back into it here. The problem is, I think there might be enough damage on the side of the field that, yeah. So what Sid's actually done there is he's KO'd the bench Trevenant, and now he can just do 50 damage with the muscle band and KO the active Trevenant, which means both Trevenants are going down in one turn. And this is why Dusknoir, I like to think when we play this game, I think there are going to be some cards that we look back on in a couple of years and think, how did that not see more play? And I think Dusknoir might be one of them. It's crazy good. No one likes playing against Dusknoir decks. Dusknoir decks have done quite well here and there, and, you know, yes, it's a stage 2, and yes, it can be clunky, but you see here, it's really having an effect. And I'd mentioned that Sid scraped in his 8th seed because he had a couple of draws. It's not such an issue in Top Cut. You ain't drawing in Top Cut. There's no such thing as a draw. So here, they've won one game each, but if time gets called, it's going to come down to prizes. And at the moment, Sid's got the prize lead. And you struggle to see how Scott's going to come back from this. Because the problem is, unless he goes Phantom Wally, and I think he's just played a Juniper, so that ain't happening, Sid's not going to be train locked this turn. Which means what Sid can do is attack and play a laser, and there's going to be 60 damage on the field, which is bad. Because that damage can just be moved over to the Phantom. Now what Scott's doing here is, again, I do like watching good players play. What he's basically doing is saying, okay, look, you're going to hit me with... He's almost abandoned the trainer lock for the minute. He's accepted the fact that he's going to be hit with Quaking Punch. And potentially laser as well. But what he's doing is essentially he's letting Sid hit the Shaymin, and then attacking and putting Shaymin back in his hand to heal the energy off, so that there's no energy left on the field, so that Dusknoir can't work its magic. The problem is, of course, that as soon as Sid gets his hands on a water energy, he is going to be able to just use Quaking Punch, Grenade Hammer, and just one-hit KO the Shaymin, and then he's one turn away from a win. Although it looks like... No, sorry, he already had enough energy. I thought he might have done. The energy's piled quite messily on the Seismitoad, but you can just about make out the water and the top of the water energy between the Seismitoad and the visible water energy. That means he can Grenade Hammer and take a couple of prizes, and you wonder what Scott's going to be able to do here. I mean, essentially, very little. Now, the good news is, as we talked about earlier in the game, Grenade Hammering gives up the trainer lock, and it allows certain things. If Scott can hit an enhanced hammer here, that will be absolutely huge. He's hit the laser. He's going to need a Wally and an energy, and he's going to have to hope that the Seismitoad stays asleep. Now, what Sid's essentially done this game, and there goes the trump card to get everything back. What Sid's essentially done this game is used Dusknoir to get rid of both the Trevenants at the same time, forcing Scott into using Shaymin, and then just Grenade Hammer the Shaymin. It's a lovely tactic. I mean, it's a mean tactic, but it's an inspired tactic, because essentially you're sitting there chipping away at each other, and as soon as there's enough damage on the board, you take out all the Trevenants, and if your opponent's just going Shaymin, you just Grenade Hammer your way to victory. So a very good strategy here from Sid, which has worked absolutely beautifully. Now, we saw in the first game when Sid won, he actually was able to keep something in the active and move all the damage off. It's something he looked into doing this game, but he wasn't able to do it. But he managed to adjust and use a different tactic, which has worked just as well. Scott, for his part, isn't doing anything wrong. He's playing very well indeed. The problem is, when you're constantly trainer locked, and your opponent is able to use Dusknoir's Sinister Hand ability to screw you over, and you're not able to get set up properly, there isn't all that much you can do. Now, Sid is going to see if he wakes up here. Now, this could be big. Now, Sid's only got 2 prizes left. I mean, what Sid really wants to do is get a water energy on that bench Seismitoad. No, because that bench Seismitoad's going to die too quickly. Although it's going to take 2 hits. No, it's not, sorry. It's going to take 3 hits. It's currently on 130. So there we go. Water energy on the bench Seismitoad. Or building up a Mewtwo, but as there's no Mewtwo on the bench and no space for a Mewtwo, he wants to put the water energy on the Seismitoad. Because he needs to Grenade Hammer. A Lysandra Grenade Hammer is enough for the game. So he needs to build that up. The other thing to remember, as I've just said, that Seismitoad on the bench has got 130 HP. 130 damage on it, sorry. It's got 50 HP left. Which means 2 attacks from that Trevenant won't kill the bench Seismitoad. So he's going to have a turn Not only that, of course, but 2 attacks will kill the active Seismitoad. And what that means is that Sid's going to have a turn with the bench Seismitoad. Scott now, he needs to get a Trevenant out. The problem is he needs to attach to the active Trevenant. And that means he's not going to be able to attack with a bench Trevenant next turn, assuming he can get another Trevenant out. Because Sid, as long as he draws a water energy, can just grenade hammer next turn. So there is the energy. He's going to get the attack. He's going to get a couple prizes. But he's not going to be able to get any energy on the bench Phantom. So there's not going to be a meaningful attack from Scott next turn. Now what he can do here is use Trevenant's attack, put 20 damage on the bench Seismitoad, and then get the finish off and get the KO with a Shaymin. That would do it, because 1 attack from Seismitoad puts him on 150, and that means that he's got 30 HP left, so an unmuscle banded Shaymin will get the KO. So that's, I suppose, the plan for Scott at the moment. And there is another Shaymin for Scott. What Scott's going to have to do, he's going to get the KO here, that's not a problem. He then needs to put at least 20 of, he needs to put 1 of the 20 damage on the Seismitoad. And then he will be able to essentially kill the second Seismitoad with Shaymin. And then that means that there's at least going to be a chance that Sid is essentially going to run out of attackers without being able to get his last 2 prizes. Of course, all Sid needs here is a Lysandra water energy, and he's got the game. So let's not get too excited for Scott's chances just yet. There's also the possibility that if he doesn't draw water energy, Sid doesn't put that second Seismitoad active so that it doesn't get killed by the Shaymin. But then Scott would just need a Lysandra to kill it. It all comes down to whether Sid's got the water energy here, really. He needs to grenade hammer next turn. And it's never fun giving up the... It's never fun giving up the trainer lock. But if you got to do it, you got to do it. And he's got the water energy there, and he's got the Lysandra, and there is the game. As we saw, an inevitability there. So a very interesting game. We saw Scott's deck do what it does, and we actually saw a game from Scott where his deck did what it was supposed to do, and he still essentially lost. And what we saw here was a very interesting Seismitoad list that, although it lost a bit in consistency, and make no mistake, it clearly lost a bit in consistency, having those tricks like the water energy to grenade hammer, like the Dusknoir, really gave Sid an advantage that other Seismitoad decks don't. And as we saw in one of the previous games, Scott's deck doesn't worry that much about Seismitoad Shaymin. Yet this Seismitoad list is much worse. We also saw, of course, that Sid's gone, from 8th place, and he's just knocked out the number 1 seed. So hopefully we'll see him again on the stream. Okay, spoiler alert, we're going to see him again on the stream. And I will be back with a top 4 game in the very near future. And I can't remember who the top 4 game is between. I think we're talking Ryan Morehouse's Shaymin Seismitoad against Kyle's Flareon, if I remember correctly. Oh, he drew a Gal ADX. So, while we watch Scott have a look through his packs here, I'm going to remind you of the usual things. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. If you have, find a friend to do so. I'm very close to 1,000 subs, and that will make me very happy. Make sure that you check out my podcast, PTCGRadio. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you haven't checked out the previous games from this series, do so in... the links are in the video description, and I will be back with games from the top 4 and the final very, very shortly. Look after yourselves till then. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.